Good afternoon. Please be seated for the next panel. It's an unusually strong one, and I say that on a day when we have lots of extremely strong panels. We have the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba. We have Leo Docherty, the Minister for Europe from the United Kingdom. We have Andriy, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. And I am Anne Applebaum. Thank you so much. We're actually picking up this panel directly from the previous panel, where you've heard at some length about the deficiencies of the international system. I was particularly struck by Alexandra Matvichuk, who I've heard several times talk about her progress as an international human rights lawyer, her realization that the institutions that she believed would be able to enforce human rights law, rule of law, were not able to do so. She used to think that it was lack of attention to the issues, but even when there was attention to the issues, she discovered that announcing or declaring or presenting evidence of war crimes, of mass rape, of torture, of the deportation of children, of realizing that that did not produce outcomes, was a turning point in her mind. The point of this panel is to accept that the international institutions are weak, to understand that they don't work the way they're supposed to, and to look at what might be the ways in which we can act in the meantime. What can be done now, both to address the issue of Russian impunity, that's Russian sense that they don't have to owe anything to anybody, either for the invasion or for the war crimes committed. So this is both about security, but it's also about justice. And I think it's appropriate to start this panel with the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, who spent an enormous amount of time thinking about how during a war you can begin to examine and even prosecute war crimes, and how you can begin to hold people accountable even if the institutions don't work that way. So, Mr. Kostin, maybe you could begin by explaining how you think about this and how you have begun to grapple with this problem.
Thank you, Anne. First of all, I think that it's absolutely axiomatic that there could be no just peace without justice and accountability. So this is our basis. You said, Anne, that the system is weak. I would say that it's not as weak as it could be, but it's weaker than civilized world should expect as a matter of response on the war of aggression, on the heinous and so much in their scale and variety of war crimes committed in Ukraine and against Ukrainians. We understood from the very first day that there are gaps in the system of accountability. It took us some time to create, as we say it, the web of accountability, and I will explain what does it mean. We understand that our primary role as the state is to investigate and prosecute war crimes in time of ongoing war, which is, I think, first time in history, not only document, but investigate and prosecute. And we understand as national system that it's our obligation before Ukrainians to prosecute these cases. And we understand that 99+% of all cases from more than 100,000 incidents of war crimes which are registered up to date would be done by Ukrainian national system. And we try to make it as stronger as possible, not only creating partnerships with our partners and friends like Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, our main expert institution, which was launched by US, UK, and European Union, and which is successfully working now, providing us not only strategic advice, but also advice on the ground, immediate advice, as we say. We created clusters of specialists, of experts who could be immediately reached by our prosecutors to get immediate advice.
Yeah, just to interrupt, I was a witness to that, as I was just saying to you, that when there's an atrocity that happens in Ukraine, you immediately have advisors, specialists on war crimes who come to the spot and who analyze and collect information that can be used at an international tribunal.
Thank you, Anne. And for us, it's important for this system to be sustainable for years and maybe decades, because we understand after we win this war on the battlefield, we will still fight for justice for years and maybe decades. Second, we of course count on international existing mechanisms, of which the International Criminal Court is the most important, where the Russian perpetrators could be charged for the crimes, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, and potentially for the crime of genocide. We work intensively with the Office of the Prosecutor, Han. I would say that on the next week, here in Kyiv, it will be a kick-off of the biggest field office of the ICC outside The Hague, here in Kyiv. We work with team of Karim Khan intensively on daily basis, and we have results. First arrest warrant against incumbent president of Russia, Putin, and commissioner in brackets, as I say, Lvova Belova, was issued in March after 5 months of our collective investigation together with their team. And we have a plan of work. We have created task forces on specific cases and will go ahead with the ICC. Third, of course, we need to create a mechanism to make all insiders, all those who initiated this war of aggression, accountable for the crime of aggression. Because never before, after Nuremberg and trials for Far East, no one in world history was punished for the crime of aggression. It's our obligation to do it, because if crime of aggression was not committed, there would be no 100,000 war crimes committed in course of it. And of course, our next level of partnership for criminal part of our accountability web is our joint efforts together with states. We have joint investigation team with 6 countries: Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, and Romania. And actually, while discussion on the tribunal, on its legal modality is still ongoing in core group of countries, we have created an investigative mechanism to prepare, to build this case, the so-called International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, which started its work on 3rd of July in The Hague. And it's under the auspices of Joint Investigation Team, with help of European Commission and on the basis of Eurojust. And of course, our partnership, I would say not partnership, but coordination with 24 countries who opened their national investigation to investigate war crimes committed in Ukraine. Some of them on the basis of universal jurisdiction, some of them not. But we are cooperating with them, and I would say, I'm ready. I'm transferring them cases because I want Russian perpetrators to be held accountable in their national systems. Of course, it will not help us statistically, but politically, it will be a strong kick against Russian perpetrators. So we proceed this work, and I hope to see in coming months first charges in some of the jurisdiction against Russian war criminals. And of course, this web also comprises of civil part, which says that every victim and survivor of war crime committed in Ukraine should get reparation from the assets of the aggressor state. And for that, we have created Register of Damage also in The Hague, and we need to then create compensation mechanism to confiscate the assets, to fill in this compensation fund, and for every victim and survivor of this war of aggression to receive their reparation.
Dmytro, Kuleba, I mean, of course, there's a danger that all this evidence is collected. It's gathered by Ukrainian courts, but then it's ignored at the international level. Describe what kind of diplomacy is necessary to begin to make some of this real? How willing are Western partners and other partners to start talking about holding Putin as the head of state to account, but also other Russians who've made decisions down the line? And what relationships do you need? What are the alternative institutions that you could imagine that could begin to make that possible?
Thank you, Anne. The space for diplomacy is definitely the issue of the International Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression. And we have to understand that in the history of humanity, the response to the Second World War was a precedent of establishing an international tribunal. It was not envisaged by then standing body of law. The response to the massacres and crimes committed in former Yugoslavia was International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And it was a precedent because there was no other tool to respond to that. So my question to the international community now, when we objectively have a problem with the current body of international law incapable of prosecuting President Putin, Prime Minister of Russia, I struggle to remember his name, and Minister Lavrov, for the crime of aggression. We need to make a precedent. That's easy, because if we have to choose between justice and legislation, we should always go for justice and change the international legislation accordingly. If this doesn't happen, then those who oppose this decision basically make a clear political and legal statement that this aggression of Russia against Ukraine is less important than the war in Yugoslavia and the Second World War and the challenges created by these wars. And I think it's unfair. So we have to go for the international tribunal, because hybrid tribunal does not answer the question how to prosecute the troika that I already mentioned. And we have a division here, and everyone knows about it, because G7 stands firmly in favor of an internationalized tribunal, which is a hybrid tribunal, and the rest of countries who have joined the core group, including Ukraine, they stand for international tribunal. And this is where diplomacy has a role to play, because on all other crimes, ICC, I think, is doing its work, and Andriy has just eloquently described to you the work in progress. Frankly, I don't have a way out of it. And 2 days ago, we were sitting with the president, and he told me, Dmytro, I tasked you to find a solution, and you didn't. And I said, yes, it's a statement of fact. I didn't. I don't have a solution. Sorry. It was the first time since I was appointed as foreign minister that I admitted that I have no solution. And we don't have a solution because our friends and partners whom we dearly appreciate and respect, they took a rock-solid position. And I think that for the sake against international tribunal, and I believe that for the sake of justice, for the sake of fighting impunity, for the sake of paying tribute to the victims and relatives, in times when the law does not fit the purpose, an honorable, dignified purpose of serving justice, we have to develop international law, as it was the case in previous decades, and make justice possible.
Leo Docherty, it's a bit unfair to make you personally responsible for the decisions of the G7, but could you speak about, where in the Western world do you see people arguing in favor of an international tribunal? Where do you see the arguments against it coming from? And can you imagine realistically such a thing coming to be, and how could it operate?
Well, I'll try my best. But before I do that, if I could just briefly say that, and put on the record that I'm here for today, and I hope my presence as the British government minister shows that the UK is still 100% committed to our support of Ukraine. I've had tremendously positive meetings with a whole range of Ukrainian government ministers today. Our full spectrum of support across military, political, diplomatic and reconstructive efforts will continue. We will be with you for as long as it takes. That includes your path towards NATO. And of course, justice is a part of that. We totally recognize that. But we also recognize the diplomatic constraints of a vote at the UN General Assembly. We are focused on the art of the possible. Any tribunal must be watertight in terms of its legality, of course. But I think we are very enthusiastic about bringing our diplomatic leverage to bear. And we're very pleased to have been working with our Ukrainian partners, with the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, working with the Prosecutor General's Office, and indeed in the core group, and also supporting the ICC. So we are focused on the art of the possible, and we are cautious about making it subject to unpredictable votes in the General Assembly, if I can put it like that.
So many people were very struck by the ICC's decision already to make Putin and one of his ministers responsible for the crime of deporting Ukrainian children. I did sometimes hear the criticism, well, you know, they've said that, but they can't do anything, so why does it matter? Andriy, Kostin, could you speak about what's the answer to that question? Does it matter that they've done that? It is a useful thing for them to have done in this interim moment?
You know, when we say that this arrest warrant against Putin is a historic decision, everyone thinks that it's only about historic because it's Putin, and because it's the president of Russia, because it's not, I would say, it's not about global south stories. I'm sorry to say like this, the work of the ICC. It's about the whole world. And no one is or could be above the law. This is a strong signal. But it's also about two other historic layers of this decision. First, timing. Last autumn, I've been in massive discussions, and all of our partners and friends who supported ICC politically and financially, it's important. They also try to ask, but usually it takes ICC tens of years, no one will wait, justice delayed is justice denied. I fully agree, but I knew that we will come with quite fast and rapid decisions. And this is historic for the ICC. As I mentioned, only 5 months it took us to build this case. And this case will be ongoing, and you will see more cases. I can't give you details, of course. So this is extremely important. And of course, another element of this success is also quite unique. In many previous cases, ICC was to overcome obstacles in the other regions, because it was difficult, but it was international instrument, which is always complementary to national mechanisms. So it meant that national mechanisms were not working. We proved that our national system is workable. And first arrest warrant in war of Russia against Ukraine was fully complementary in its nature, because we can't prosecute Putin because of his personal immunity. And this is also historic. So historic is our level of cooperation with our international partners and friends. They know it's not only my office of Prosecutor General, it's dozens of state agencies who provided us full, comprehensive and very rapid information and evidences to be analyzed and used by the ICC. So I think, as a matter of showing that no one is or could be above the law, this is a historic, to deter any other Russians who could be ready to commit war crimes, it's also important. And also to show to the whole civilized world that Putin is not a person with whom you can shake hands. This is also important.
Yeah, I was very struck by Putin's decision not to go to South Africa, which may well have been sparked by the ICC decision.
This is one of the results, and this is really important and historic.
So it's a kind of argument in favor even of using these courts and using these systems even when they can't be fully implemented, until the war ends. Dmytro, what other impacts of the ICC decision do you see? Has it made your job more difficult or less difficult? Do you see, sometimes I worry that there are these kinds of, cliques of foreign leaders who don't like seeing cliques of leaders who don't like seeing other leaders put in jail. Have you had any pushback from it?
Well, you rightly said that we were all struck by Putin's decision not to go to South Africa, but I believe we should also credit South Africa for not waiving him of immunities, for not finding a legal solution that would allow him to do it. And it was a result of diplomacy, because there were very strong forces in South Africa to allow Putin to come. And there were reasons to criticize them, but when there are reasons to give credit, we should do that. And they also created an important precedent that ICC warrants must be respected. This is fundamental. Any other country that is party to the Rome Statute and that will be facing similar challenge with a warrant will have to look at how South Africa handled it, despite all the political pressures. When it comes to your direct question, I mean, if our strategy is that soil should burn under Russian feet everywhere in the world, then I'm happy to see more ICC warrants being issued, because we have to fight them literally on every corner and in every quarter of the world. And international legal space is definitely in itself an important theater of war, where things have to be played by very strict rules within the rule of law principle. But still, I think the most important part of this ICC warrant against Putin was a message that ICC has no fear. Is not limited by political considerations of different kinds, but aims at serving justice. And of course it was very helpful. All of these things help us to break the path towards, through all these difficulties and obstacles to justice.
Leo Docherty, another piece of this story is reparations. And since we're beginning to do justice before the end of the war, prosecuting war crimes before the end of the war, isn't it maybe time to talk about reparations before the end of the war? I believe you've spoken about this in the past. The UK has a lot of Russian assets in its territory. Other European countries do. Isn't this a way to begin paying reparations now, rather than waiting for the end of the war?
Well, and that's a great question, and we are absolutely are looking at that. We have frozen in excess of £18 billion worth of Russian assets in UK. We've also sanctioned more than 1,600 individuals, 29 banks with more than £1 trillion of international assets, and frozen £20 billion worth of UK Russian trade. So we are focused on the question of whether we can move from freezing to seizing. Again, that would need to be there would need to be a very, very clear legal route to that, and I can just say that we have an army of lawyers looking at that in the British Foreign Office.
And what's the question? Is there a question? Sure. This is someone who knows about the army of lawyers.
I'm Marisa Lutsevich. I work in London-based Chatham House, and we had under the Chatham House discussion with lawyers about making Russia pay. And of course, they immediately get entangled with sovereign immunity, and they find the way to say why it's illegal. Whereas the minister was saying we need to set the precedent. So do you think, and where the push must come for the lawyers to set the new precedent?
It's a good challenge, and of course we are legislators, so we make the laws, right? So what's legal is up to the House of Commons and the British government, but of course it needs to be watertight in terms of inevitable legal challenge, and that is really important. So if it was easy, we would have done it already.
But the question is there the political will to do it?
Yes, because every legislator, he is also a politician. And this is actually, for some of the very challenging issue where we are, what is first, political will or legal solution? Our understanding is political will should be first. Lawyers will do their job in accordance with instructions made by politicians in the law, somewhere, but when lawyers are put at the first place, then we can wait for political decisions for long. I'm saying as a professional lawyer.
We have one more comment from the audience. Sorry, I didn't. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Stephen Dowd. I'm an MP from the House of Commons in the UK, and actually Leo's opposite number. And just to reiterate what Leo said, I mean, there is complete unity on support for Ukraine, and there's a cross-party delegation here from the UK, and that support is absolute. But there is, on that question of the use of Russian state assets, there is the political will there, and indeed a cross-party resolution was passed in the UK. And I really do urge, and I hope that governments will come forward much more quickly with legislation on this, because those assets should be used. They can be used. There are clear examples from around the world where legislation is moving forward, where examples are moving forward. So I think if it was put before the House of Commons, it would get full support, and I hope that would lead to action being taken in other legislatures around the world as well.
Yeah, I just want to add one simple line to it. Law always serves the purpose. Countries change laws when they need to adapt laws to the purpose. And time has come to do it with regard to two issues: International Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression of Russia and compensation mechanisms. Unfortunately, we are in a kind of a deadlock on both, because we have divisions on the first issue, and there is clearly lack of will on the second issue. I'm sorry to say it. I'm grateful to all partners. You are indispensable. You are great. But specifically on this issue, we are going to drown in legal solutions. Guys, when financial markets and politicians face problems they want to solve, lawyers always find solutions, okay? And if after a year and a half, I'm still hearing from Europe, from North America, we are working on it, there are issues that we have to address. I respect it, I politely look at colleagues, but I know what's happening. There is lack of will to come to a conclusion. So we have to change that. Otherwise, all of this is going to drown in endless discussions when new problems will begin to pop up globally.
And look what Dmytro says. It's about two issues: the tribunal and the potential confiscation of Russian sovereign assets. And both issues are around the concern about immunity. Personal immunity of Putin as an incumbent president, and sovereign immunity with regard to potential confiscation of sovereign funds. And look, immunity and impunity. Only one letter. You change one letter in this word, and immunity appears to be impunity. I think that no one in the world, in civilized world, wants impunity to win over the crimes committed by Russians. So maybe at some occasion politicians should forget about immunity in order to avoid impunity.
Very elegantly put. Thank you. Leo Docherty, could you speak to the issue of political will? Maybe not just in your country, because it's unfair to pick on the UK, but do you sense the formation of a political will in the G7, in the broader democratic community, to begin to take this, this question of impunity seriously?
I think, let's be honest, if you look across Europe, the unity of political will among European populations is variable. In my country, interestingly, our support for Ukraine is overwhelmingly popular, and it's reflected by, as my colleague Stephen said, complete agreement in the House of Commons, which is actually very unusual. All British political parties agree 100% on our current policy. That would be the case whichever party was in power. And that reflects the unity of the British public view that this is a very clear fight for justice and survival of Ukrainian sovereignty. But to be honest, if you look across the rest of Europe, there's not a unified picture in that regard. So I think there is more diplomatic and political work to be done, and I think the economic situation is a function of that, and rising inflation and the deep European energy links with Russia is still very important. So I think that is a work in progress and something we cannot take for granted. But we will always be at the front of the pack in making that argument.
Right, we just have a couple of minutes left. Andriy, Kostin, I wonder if you want to end by explaining the importance of this kind of legal and political change. What would it mean for ordinary Ukrainians, for example, to have a big international tribunal? Why would that matter to you? How would that change anything here?
I think that it's impossible to any of our partners and friends who support us in our international tribunal endeavors to explain, it's impossible to explain to Ukrainians that such tribunal will be without Putin at the dock. It's impossible to explain. Every Ukrainian wants tribunal where Putin would be prosecuted and punished. And it's our, I would say, obligation of the civilized world to create such tribunal. And this is also very important. The system of international criminal law requires, and international humanitarian law requires, that servicemen could be killed legally. I'm sorry to say this. Maybe it's rude words, but international humanitarian law protects only civilians from violations of their rights. And punishment for the crime of aggression is the only matter of justice for all Ukrainian servicemen who were killed in course of this war. And let's not forget, many of these servicemen yesterday were civilians, and it's matter of justice for their families. The only legal instrument is prosecution and punishment for the crime of aggression.
Thank you, and we are out of time. Thank you very much. Really, really important panel. Thank you.